Let me ask you this. You're listening to the NK News podcast, so you know more about North Korea than most. But how about the South? To really understand what's happening on the peninsula, you need to know about South Korea. And now you can, through our new Korea Pro news and analysis service. This is not your average news service. It's a thoroughly researched analysis of South Korea's politics, society, and economy from an international perspective. But you know what the cherry on top is? The absolute lack of commercial influences. No ads, no sponsored articles. It's just pure, objective analysis by a team of qualified specialists. And the best part? As a listener of this podcast, you get a 25% discount. All you have to do is use the coupon code PODCAST during your sign-up. So head over to koreapro.org/podcast and start your journey with Korea Pro. That's koreapro.org/podcast. Hello listeners and welcome to the NK News podcast. And today for our short pre-interview, I've got Shreyas Reddy here. Hello Shreyas, good to see you again.
Good to see you as well, Jacko.
So we're going to talk about two of the most prominent themes of the last week or so. The first one is the multiple closure of North Korean embassies around the world and seemingly a bit of a shake-up in the foreign ministry, a redeployment of resources. So tell us what's happening. What's the big overview?
Well, like you said, we've seen a number of closures. It began with Ugandan government-owned media reporting that North Korea was shutting down its embassy in Kampala, seemingly in a bid to increase the efficiency of its operations. And then 2 days later, same reports came out of Angola. Essentially, North Korea was shutting down its operations. In the case of the Ugandan one, they said that they would move their operations to Equatorial Guinea, just continue relations with Uganda from there. And on the whole, it does...
So from East Africa way over to West Africa.
Yeah,
far
effectively.
West Africa.
Yeah, and it's a little curious as well because right next to Uganda, you've got Tanzania, which is another country where North Korea has long had an embassy and maintained relations. Throws raises a lot of questions about the fate of North Korea's other embassies in the region.
Right.
So
you've also got language issues. I mean, Uganda is an English-speaking country. Equatorial Guinea is a Spanish-speaking country.
So, well, it'll be interesting to see what comes next. And essentially, it does seem like what they said is it's a bit of increased efficiency. So they're going to be handling a lot more of these operations remotely, but they aren't discounting diplomacy. It's not like this an end to diplomacy. In the case of both the Ugandan and the Angolan announcements, it sounded like they still have hopes for continued engagement, just in a different manner. So it seems that North Korea's reducing the number of embassies, but will maintain the outreach from those locations. So it's one of the possible implications is that it could be due to just financial challenges. North Korea has had economic concerns for the last 4 years, in particular thanks to the pandemic, but even before that, sanctions were already taking their toll. And maybe the foreign ministry just does not have the resources it does at this point to warrant that level of engagement.
Yeah.
So we might see a few more in the coming weeks. Certainly there are indications that North Korea has also shut down its embassy in Spain, shutting down its consulate in Hong Kong and a lot of other countries in Africa and elsewhere.
Yeah, Spain's an interesting one. That was the target of that attack a few years ago. The sort of, what was it? It was
a
like
raid.
A fake robbery disguised to cover a defection that didn't end up happening.
That was certainly an interesting incident, but even before that raid, the embassy was already perhaps low priority for North Korea because ever since Spain expelled the North Korean ambassador in late 2017 amid sanctions and North Korean missile and nuclear tests, I think essentially North Korea had already ceased to regard that as a particularly important one.
Right.
We've had a former North Korean diplomat even told us that essentially it made very little sense to them politically or economically. And the economic part is an important aspect for North Korean embassies.
Yeah, we did see back in the in the mid 1990s during the famine that around 10 embassies worldwide were closed down, and And in 2008, when they closed the short-lived embassy in Australia, they said that was for economic reasons as well. And we do know from not just Taeyong Ho's memoir, but other books too, that generally speaking, North Korean embassies are expected to be financially self-supporting and, in fact, not only sustaining themselves, but sending money back to the motherland.
Absolutely. Many North Korean embassies, that is a part of their function as well, that especially when it comes to North Korea's income, quite often they end up acquiring materials, acquiring revenue, sending that back to North Korea. This has been what's been reported for many years in many countries. And certainly it does appear that there have been tighter sanctions since 2016-17, and that enforcement across the board has made it much more difficult for them to also generate that additional revenue. So again, that's where you're saying how much point is there for them to continue maintaining all these embassies when they're not perhaps generating as much as they used to. But again, that could be one of several factors. We have also seen North Korea has gradually decreased its diplomatic engagement in general, even before the pandemic, when it just sealed itself off from the world. I think ever since the Hanoi summit, when things went south, North Korea kind of retreated into its shell a little bit, and diplomatic engagement came to be restricted to a select few countries. So I think this is part of a bigger picture, and you're also going to say how much it'll be interesting to see how North Korea, as it now starts to reopen, how much it will engage in those other countries. Also, there are still questions about when other countries will be allowed back into North Korea, when they'll be able to resume their diplomatic operations, their embassies. So,
do you think we'll see a greater redeployment of North Korean diplomatic resources into countries like China and Russia, where it is easier to do trade?
Well, there certainly is. So there are reports that there are indications of a wider North Korean diplomatic reshuffle and reallocation of resources. Where that will be remains to be seen. China and Russia would certainly be
obvious choices.
Yeah, and I think to some extent, certainly in the last few years, when a lot of North Korean diplomats could not go back to Pyongyang, countries like China would have been an alternative.
Right.
So
it does make closing the Hong Kong consulate a bit of an unusual decision, though, doesn't it? Especially, I mean, Hong Kong, it's not that far from home.
Yeah.
It's a good trade hub. It's run by the PRC now, more or less.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on why Hong Kong was chosen to close?
Honestly, there is very little clear reasoning for that. I think even China essentially said, we respect North Korea's decision, but there weren't really any particular reasons given for it that were clear-cut. So it's something that perhaps in time we will see them shed a little more light on their reasons, see what comes out of it. But at the moment, all we can really do is wait and watch.
Right. Wow. Okay, that's very interesting there. So they're possibly retreating back into its shell a little bit, focusing more inwardly. The second big theme this week is the release of the midterm report by the United Nations panel of experts on North Korea. And that, for those who want to know more about what the panel of experts is and what it does, go back to episode 304, where I interviewed the former coordinator of the panel of experts, Eric Penton-Vogt, about how that all works. But what's the news about the latest report that's come out?
Well, I think it is a long report, including annexes. It's over 400 pages.
Yeah.
But at the same time, one has to realize that the panel at this point, over the last few years, they haven't really had a chance to go into North Korea. They're largely reliant on information that's coming to them from other sources, usually what member states report, open source reporting, and satellite imagery and details, and other tools like that. So certain areas, perhaps investigation can be a little hampered, and a lot comes down to how much others are willing to cooperate with them. But other areas, for example, let's say maritime issues, shipping, that aspect is something that does tend to take up a fair chunk of the report's content.
Identifying ships, where are they from, who owns them, when
Exactly.
do they turn off their trackers, what are they doing in ship-to-ship transfers, that kind of thing. There's
Exactly.
a lot of photography and analysis in those reports about that.
And so the panel tracked, for example, it said North Korea has acquired at least I think 13 freighters and one tanker, added them to its commercial fleet just this year alone. And
it's a big increase.
Yeah, that is a big increase, and overall it's brought it up to I think something like 52 since 2020.
Wow.
And many of these are acquired from China, although China certainly has. So it does say that some of the reporting in the panel's report is inaccurate and does not necessarily reflect the reality of the situation.
Right, China's obviously not on board with all the conclusions, although there is a Chinese representative on the panel of experts, right?
Yes.
But the Chinese state hit back and said, we're enforcing sanctions, we're fully compliant, we're doing all that we can.
Yeah.
There's nothing to see here, basically, is their message.
That's essentially it. And there was the same for other areas as well. So, for example, some member states may have did allege that there were other illegal transactions, perhaps financial transactions, cyber transactions taking place within China. And China, in its reply to the panel, said, "No, we have found no such evidence of any such activities in the country." So a lot of this, at the end of the day, comes down to who says what, and perhaps those wider tensions that we also see at international level also play out in the report's composition. And there will always be, I think, in the absence of on-the-ground confirmation of what North Korea is doing, until people can go in, it will be hard to certainly verify a lot of these things. But the most we can do, and certainly what the panel is doing, is trying to keep an eye on what the open source information says, what is happening, just keeping a list of these where North Korea may possibly violating sanctions, and trying to work with member states to address those issues and get to the bottom of things.
Did any other countries, perhaps those starting with the letter R, release any statements after the panel of experts report saying that this is not true, this didn't happen?
Well, I think certainly depends on the story, but there would be some, for example, where again with certain transactions, again with the cyber, with other kinds of sanctions evasion techniques, where the various countries, so China, Russia, and others would have said this. We have found no evidence of this. This has not really happened. And even some other countries, perhaps, for example, in the case of North Korea's overseas IT workers, some of them, those cases were linked to Laos. So Laos got its own little small section in the report where Laos did not actually respond to the panel or tell them what's going on. So I think essentially North Korea still does have close relations with those countries, of course, and you certainly can't necessarily conclusively prove anything at this point, but there has been a lack of confirmation, lack of verification from those sides, or in some cases denials, as in the case of China and Russia, saying what these other countries are alleging. We refute them. Did not happen.
Does the report give any suggestions or recommendations on how North Korea's violations of UN sanctions could be better, restricted, foiled, stopped, slowed down?
I think at the end of the day, we also need to recognize that this is, with the UN report, there are a lot of competing interests at play. And there are certainly some areas where they outline measures, different themes, different measures will, different domains have a different level of detail. So in some cases, they would be in a better position to say, this is something where this is a clear violation, or this is something where more needs to be done to monitor this. We'd want countries to step up. But in many other cases, it just feels like a compilation of lists of incidents, and saying, okay, we haven't actually heard back from the relevant member states, or they're denying it. And they do have some recommendations here and there, but at this point, many of them tend to feel a little more generic, depending on which domain it is. Some of them are a little more, shall we say, they're perhaps trying to reinforce the messages from earlier reports. Because, again, going back to what we said at the start, this is something that has been going on for a while, and the panel has not necessarily had a chance to examine what is truly going on that's new in North Korea. So much of the report goes into reiterating old cases that perhaps they haven't yet had a conclusion on. that they would like to see more information on, that they're still investigating. And so the recommendations also reflect that, where we're saying we want to reiterate that we want countries to step up enforcement of these sanctions.
Yeah, at the end of the day, that comes back to what Eric Penton-Vogt said in my interview with him, that it's up to each individual member state of the United Nations to police the sanctions, and where the sanctions fall down is where member states stop implementing them or executing them. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today, Shreyas, and telling us about those two big stories. Stay tuned, because after the break I have an interview with American academic Jacob Reidhead about the politicization of North Korean human rights here in South Korea, and that's an interesting interview.
Right. Thank you for having me.
Imagine having the most wide-ranging news, analysis and opinion on North Korea at your fingertips. Sounds great, right? Well, it's possible with NK News. They publish a truly diverse selection of unique articles every business day and provide you with valuable newsletters and alerts. Opinion writers and journalists include regular podcast guests like Andrei Lankov, Jongmin Kim, Chad O'Carroll, Colin Zwerko, Niels Weisenzer, Peter Ward, and Shreyas Reddy. And because I know you'll love the product as much as I do, here's something special for you. Use the code PODCAST to get a $100 discount on your subscription. Redeem this podcast-only special today by visiting nknews.org/discount. That's nknews.org/discount. So what are you waiting for? Sign up for NK News today and get ahead of the headlines on North Korea. For today's long interview, I'm joined by Dr. Jacob Reidhead, currently an assistant professor of Asian studies at National Chengchi University in Taipei. He obtained his PhD in sociology from Stanford University in 2020. Jacob has spent much of his adult life in Korea and speaks fluent Korean. In 2008 and 2009, he spent 6 months in North Korea monitoring a USAID food program. And we're going to include a link to his webpage in the show notes. Hi, Jacob, and welcome on the show.
Thanks. What you didn't mention in your intro was that I've been a big fan of yours over the last few years with your running these podcasts on NK News and all your other ventures. So I'm happy to be here. We're talking with you.
Excellent. Oh, thanks very much. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So, Jacob, I think it's best to start with some clarification of terms, and I'll do that by way of your backstory. As I mentioned, you spent 6 months in North Korea monitoring a USAID food program. Was that a humanitarian project or a human rights project, or a bit of both?
That was a humanitarian project. The program was approved by USAID and administered by five NGOs, including Mercy Corps. I was representing Mercy Corps in that effort. So it wasn't, it's a food program, humanitarian aid program.
How do you draw the line between humanitarian and human rights, or where?
Well, I guess I like the formulation that civil and political rights versus economic, social, and cultural rights. That's one way that people draw the line, and I think that generally corresponds to different humanitarian. I think people who would side with who favor economic, social, and cultural rights would also be aligned with humanitarian aid. Would see humanitarian aid as a form of kind of grassroots human rights, whereas people who favor civic and political rights of a more top-down and legalistic form may not see humanitarian aid as a form of human rights. So that's how I would.
Right. You've kind of preempted my next question, which is that human rights are often divided into two groups. And as you've just mentioned there, you have the economic, social, and cultural rights, which in your paper that we're going to talk about later on, you shortened to ESCR. And then you have the civil and political rights, which you shortened to CPR. Is that a natural division into those two groups, or is that an artificial and arbitrary distinction?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. I mean, you could probably guess from my paper that I believe this division may have been reified by partisan politics. In my mind, there's no reason why one couldn't embrace all versions of rights kind of holistically, from top-down legalistic approaches, bottom-up humanitarian aid approaches, but the two do tend to get divided when politics get involved.
Have they always been divided that way? I mean, I don't recall the Universal Declaration of Human Rights dividing that way, or am I misremembering?
I also don't know, going back that far, I'm not sure, but I would point to Andrew Yeo's paper, his book. Was it Network Activism in North Korea? It's a book that I published a chapter in that book, but
Ah,
Andrew Yeo's chapter and his I think he co-authored the introduction with Daniel Chubb, but he researched the kind of historical divide between those two camps in the United States, like back in the 1970s when there were two different congressional committees dealing with human rights, one Republican and one Democrat, and
mhm.
he kind of tracks it back to that, where the Republican committee was pursuing civil and political human rights to kind of criticize countries we didn't like Iran and so on, and the Democrats were pushing a more humanitarian version of it. And I think so. I mean, that's I don't know if it goes back further than that, but that's definitely kind of parallels like what I point to, what I've identified in Korea.
Give us that year again, because I missed it the first time.
The division that Andrew is talking about is
Hmm.
in the 1970s. Starts in the
70s. Okay.
1970s. Yeah. And the
Mhm.
Democratic committee, I believe, was eventually kind of dissolved. So the Republican committee, the more kind of the committee that was following the top-down approach was more long-lived than the other one. So he kind of points to that as when civic and political CPR became more kind of hegemonic at least in the United States.
But now let's not get ahead of ourselves. You've already mentioned the word
Yeah.
hegemonic, but why do you call civil and political rights top down?
I think the strategies for so civic and political rights include things like political freedoms, religious freedoms, media freedom. So these things are usually associated with governments and government institutions and laws. And so when these rights are not present, if they're suppressed or not preserved, usually the strategies for trying to ensure these rights are legalistic. They
Hmm.
aim at like governments or regimes or laws or policies in order to ensure those rights. So that's why I think the CPR tends to be associated with top-down,
Because they're
legalistic,
enshrined in
institutional.
laws. Okay, I
Right.
see. Now, you've just recently published an article in Korean Studies. We'll share the link in the show notes called Decamping the Partisans, US Hegemony and South Korea's Divisive Discourse on North Korean Human Rights. In this paper, or in writing this paper, what is the question that you tried to answer?
I think I tried to debunk the idea. I guess this is one of those like propositions where everybody thinks that the division in human rights is caused by X, but it's actually caused by Y, right?
Ah, so
So
what is the X? What do people normally think it's?
so I think people when they look at human rights, they either look at they look at human rights, the field of human rights at face, they take it at face value and they say, oh, if there's a division in the approach, if there's a division between civic and political rights, CPR, and then these economic, social, cultural rights, which, as you pointed out, is arbitrary, that it must be somehow that division must arise because people have different views about human rights.
Hmm.
Some people think that CPR are more important than ESCR, or some people prefer the strategies employed by. Some people prefer legalistic strategies over, humanitarian or grassroots strategies. So that's the X, right?
Okay, and in the TLDR short version, what's the Y? What actually is the that thing that causes the difference in approaches on North Korean human rights?
I point to partisan politics. I think it's partisan
Now,
politics.
you're talking about South Korean partisan politics or US or both?
So I mean, I think it's both. And again, I'd point to Andrew Yeo's paper.
Yeah.
Andrew Yeo makes the argument that human rights were kind of divided by partisan politics in the United States. I make the argument that this was also true in South Korea. Yeah, along
Okay.
conservative and progressive camps.
Now, to bring back hegemony into it, you basically summarize in the paper that it's South Korean political attitudes towards US hegemony. So, what is US hegemony? How do you define it, and how can we recognize it when we see it?
So I think in the paper, I don't know exactly how I word it. Do I say hegemony is the power to influence policy and political action, something like that?
Hmm.
I think the real critical point here is that when I don't want people, when you hear like U.S. hegemony, you might take you might think I'm coming from like anti-establishment or kind of Marxist perspective or something like that. I think here U.S. hegemony really refers to, again, we're talking about South Korean politics. We're talking about South Korean conservatives and liberals or progressives. The thing that has always divided South Korean conservatives and progressives have been this dates all the way back to prior to democratization, right? Should the government, prioritize kind of strict rule over civil liberties, and what should be the stance towards reunification with North Korea? And a big player in all of that has been, the U.S. role. And so when I say U.S. hegemony here, I'm referring primarily to how South Koreans perceive the role of the United States on the peninsula. And historically, that has been aligned with conservative camp. The United States was a big supporter, of the Park Chung-hee regime. And the United States has had boots on the ground in Korea for going on 75 years now. So, yeah, so that's what I mean by, the U.S. military and economic presence and influence in the affairs of the Korean Peninsula and in determining, its political destiny or its political.
So it would seem to me that South Korean attitudes towards U.S. influence would map pretty perfectly onto conservative or progressive political parties.
I think that's how it's played out with human rights. I think I agree for the most part, that when it comes to security issues, when it comes to particular issues where the U.S. has expressed a strong opinion or a vested interest in the Korean Peninsula, often their views align with the conservative camp. I mean, we would be mistaken to think that all, kind of left and right politics in Korea align with left-right politics in America, but
right. Yeah.
But at least on these key issues of the view of optimal reunification with the North and political stance in the region and the military issue, on these issues, yeah, I do think they map pretty well.
Now, it seemed to me that for a long time, or at least from the time that I started observing it in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, it seemed to me that the South Korean progressives were not really interested in talking about human rights and particularly human rights abuses in North Korea. But I was interested to learn from your paper that wasn't always the way. In fact, in 1994, it was the liberal opposition that held a North Korean human rights symposium, one of the first big public events on this topic that wasn't run by the government.
Yeah, I think the progressives the liberals have all, because they were interested in, humanitarian aid and they were interested in the kind of engagement with the North, they were pushing this, what we might think of as the leftist version of human rights, the economic, social, and cultural rights. And they had been interested in that far earlier than the right kind of picked up on the civic and political rights before they showed interest in that. And I think before we go on any further, like when we talk about human rights in North Korea and you say, we think the left hasn't been involved in human rights or whatnot, I think a big part of our kind of semantics around human rights have been influenced by kind of historical outcomes in the last 20 years, right? Which is that these days, when we say human rights, we tend to associate human rights with the civic and political variety of human rights.
And the ones you mentioned before, the freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of political organization, that kind of thing.
Right. And so because historically that kind of branch of human rights has become the dominant branch, like now when we say human rights, we tend to just assume CPR, right? And then when we're referring to ESCR, these economic, social, and cultural rights, we tend to use language like humanitarian aid or something and not link it to, we tend not to use the language of human rights, So I think the
so
language
food,
of human
clothing,
rights
and shelter, that would fit into the ESCR, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Right.
And cultural exchanges and yeah.
What about things like due process of law and not being imprisoned in a concentration camp? Where would that fit in?
I think CPR would definitely claim that, right? Anytime the state is kind of infringing on your political rights, I guess that would be probably lumped. That would be lumped with this CPR.
Yeah. Now, the last few years, I'm sure you're aware, the interest in North Korea and publicly expressed concern about North Korean human rights across the broad spectrum of the South Korean public has actually dropped considerably. The percentage of people under the age of 40 who are interested in North Korea and Korean unification is lower than ever. Kinu does these studies every year, and you find that, if you graph it, the numbers are really shrinking. Do you have an explanation for that? Does that somehow, in the framework of partisan politics, how can we explain the drop of interest in North Korea and North Korean human rights?
Sure. I think, the interest kind of peaked in the early, I would say in 2013, 2014, because I think the partisan politics kind of played out in the domestic arena. It played out in the United States and it played out in the United Nations. And I think it kind of culminated in United Nations Commission for Human Rights report on human rights in North Korea, which came out in 2013. I think it was approved in 2014. And then followed by the passage of the North Korea Human Rights Act in South Korea. And the United States had already passed the North Korean Human Rights Act, I think, 10 years earlier. And the left had kind of resisted the progress of this report and also the passage of these human rights acts. But once these acts were passed and the reports were written and published, the conservative North Korean human rights movement had kind of reached the limits of what you could achieve through legal avenues, right? So once you established legally in all ways possible in like national legislation and in the United Nations, this commission report, what more can you do short of recommending, Kim Jong-un to The Hague or, some kind of military intervention? So I think that, this kind of played out in legal venues and on all levels, and the conservatives kind of won those battles. And then there was nothing more really that there were no more legal remedies that could be taken short of more radical forms of intervention. And so I think that's when the partisan politics kind of fizzled, was because the conservatives had kind of achieved their aims as far as they could go.
Right.
And there was nothing more for the left to kind of oppose, and there were no more kind of checkpoints, for the right to kind of pursue. So, it just kind of, I think the North Korean human rights movement in general, like since the passage of the UN Commission report, have just kind of the funding has dried up to a large extent, and I think it's more or less kind of over at this point. I mean,
so this year, which is the 10th anniversary of the UN Commission of Inquiry report, you're if I understand you correctly, you're basically saying that commission or the report by the commission 10 years ago was really the high watermark of interest in North Korean human rights. And once that was completed, as you say, there's nothing really else to do. There's no other remedies through legal avenues. That's where interest peaked, and after that, it's dropped off. Is that pretty much it?
Yeah. I think the right kind of achieved this consensus in the U.S. and Korea and kind of global, at the UN, that okay, North Korea is a bad actor. They repress human rights. Okay, like a majority consensus has been achieved. And what are you going to do about it now, right? So I think that was the high watermark of like organizational activity in the North Korean human rights movement. And since then, it's kind of you still have organizations are still active. Link is still active, and HMKR in DC are still active, but I think their funding has gone down and their activities have gone down. The number of defector-led organizations have kind of pivoted away from human rights to do other types of things now. So, yeah.
So how does a particular partisan stance on both U.S. hegemony and therefore approaches to North Korean human rights, how does that determine what kind of approach different people and NGOs and political parties want to take on how to achieve an improvement in whichever area of human rights they view as most important or most urgent, whether that be civil and political rights on the one hand or economic, social, and cultural rights on the other?
If you're on the right, if you're a conservative legislator in South Korea, again, then your identity, your stance on North Korean human rights is secondary, right, to your primary identity as a conservative, right, which is determined by your you favor strong U.S. military presence on the peninsula. You favor a more adversarial stance towards North Korea. So how will that affect your view of North Korean human rights? If that's your political stance or your political identity as a conservative, then you're going to favor more a critical view of the North Korean government. And so you're going to tend to assume favor the CPR approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're on the left, if you're progressive and you've spent your days as a student protester, back in the 80s, and then, as a progressive legislator in Korea now, and you see kind of U.S. presence on the peninsula as this kind of legacy of supporting dictatorship in South Korea, and you would like the troops to leave, right? Maybe you have some kind of anti-American stance, or you favor engagement with North Korea, then your
the North Korean
views,
government, right?
Right, with the North Korean
government. So
working
together with the North Korean government, doing things through North Korean government channels, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Then which version or flavor of North Korean human rights would you favor? You would favor the ESCR, you know. So it's your primary kind of fundamental political alliance, allegiances or kind of orientation is going to determine which form of human rights you favor for North Korea.
Well, also how you try to make an improvement in those
And
areas,
the strategies.
right?
That's
Yeah, the
right.
strategy.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the strategies that's right. Yeah.
So in your paper, tell us, you use this phrase contentious strategies in North Korean human rights. Tell us a little bit about what does contentious strategies mean and what are some examples of those contentious strategies?
The contentious strategies, I think, are strategies undertaken by the political right, both in the United States and in South Korea, to use suppression of human rights in North Korea, the failure of the North Korean government to ensure, human rights of its citizens, as a way to criticize the regime and as a way to kind of leverage the regime or compel the regime to conform to whatever, U.S. or Korean like political goals are. So I think initially, these strategies have kind of been ratcheted up over time, over this time period that we were talking about, the early 2000s up until 2013, 2014, and in the early stages, it was just this naming and shaming. We would say, just kind of call North Korea out. Oh, they're, violating human rights. Over time, we added sanctions to the mix. We added North Korean human rights were securitized in the sense that North Korean human rights were linked to the North Korean nuclear program. So those two issues were not originally linked, but during the six-party talks and the North Korean nuclear crisis, those issues were actually linked by the United States and South Korean conservatives. And so that's what we mean by, securitization.
So that securitization means linking human rights issues to the issues of nuclear weapons and disarmament and that sort of thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So and once you link, North Korean human rights to the nuclear politics, now, it takes on this whole kind of security and kind of militant perspective. And then once those were linked, then you had these kind of legal remedies, the passage of the North Korean Human Rights Acts in U.S. and in South Korea, and the pursuit of this, eventually this, the UN United Nations Commission of Inquiry on North Korean Human Rights Report. So these are all strategies that were kind of, that were escalated from rhetoric to very strong rhetoric and securitization, all the way up to kind of legal remedies, sanctions, and
these are the strategies that North Korea would call a hostile approach, hostile stance towards itself, right? Now, you've also mentioned encouraging defections in your paper. Can you tell us a bit about that? What does it mean? I mean, do defectors need encouragement?
It's hard to know. It's hard to trace back. If you talk to North Koreans who've come to South Korea, it's very hard to parse intentionality going back to when they were in North Korea, because they've passed through so many. So if a North Korean defector arrives in South Korea, they've at some point they crossed the border into China in most cases, and then in many cases they stayed in China for several years, and then at some point they may have crossed into a third country like Laos or Thailand, and then or Mongolia, and then came into South Korea. It's not clear. I mean, when North Korean citizens leave the country, that the South Korea, that their goal is to defect politically, or that their goal is to come to South Korea, especially in the early. Now it's a little bit different because you have this kind of migration chains and whatnot, family members. But in the early days, you had a lot of North Koreans just crossing into China to do to work and kind of shuttle back and forth, and just for economic reasons. At what point did they decide that they're going to leave China and come to South Korea, or so I don't know. I mean,
basically, it comes down to some groups are accused of trying to lure North Koreans out of North Korea en masse to in this way bring about more defections and therefore perhaps bring about change or instability in North Korea, right? That's sort of the sum total of it, as I understand it.
I mean, I think that's the logic on the left, the logic on the right, right? The logic on the right is that if we can encourage enough North Koreans to defect, that accomplishes a few goals in terms of like South Korea and in terms of like Western media, that demonstrates that North Korea is a place that people don't want to live. That it's a place that they want to defect from. So that's a kind of a media victory if you can do that. But there's also a more kind of strategic outcome, is that if enough North Koreans leave, that it will like destabilize the North Korean regime. So,
which hints at the idea that regime change may also be an actual goal of people who are supporting civil and political rights, right?
very clearly. So, I mean, this is where the kind of right side, these strategies, to encourage defection on the right are, from a human rights perspective, may seem a little disingenuous because you're kind of using defectors for the aims of regime destabilization, right? And also encouraging defection may actually encouraging defection publicly and vocally may actually make things harder for North Koreans living in China, right? So on the surface you might be saying we're encouraging defection to improve their lives, but the reality of it, if you're drawing attention to this issue, you're embarrassing China, right? You're forcing China's hand. If you weren't drawing attention to this in Western media, China might just be able to kind of let this go or let it, But if you kind of calling attention to it, then they're kind of respond and react by cracking down, and they may actually the net effect may actually be a decrease in human rights of North Koreans like living in precarious North Koreans living in China.
Yeah. Now, what about defectors who are already or refugees or defectors from North Korea who are already living in South Korea? They can certainly be affected by this politicization or this partisanship of North Korean human rights issues too, can't they? And I remember hearing during the last administration, the Moon Jae-in administration, there were North Korean refugees living here who felt that they were being silenced or told to sort of keep out of the way and not talk about North Korean human rights issues publicly. So how are they affected by this politicization?
Exactly right. I think, and this is where I want to make my political views very clear. Although we've talked about these contentious strategies which the right employs to kind of criticize North Korea, the left is not free of blame in this partisan conflict, right? So I don't want to come down as I probably come down as sounding as if I favor the ESCR over CPR, or I favor the left over the right, or I'm critical of the right. But this is where I think where this partisan divide over human rights it ends up placing blame on both sides, right? And this is where when North Korean defectors come to South Korea, if the left was truly sincere about kind of improving the plight of North Koreans, you would think that would extend to North Korean defectors living in the South, right? But this is where once defectors come to the South, it tends to be the right, it tends to be conservative North Korean human rights groups who embrace these defectors, albeit for some of it might be genuine concern for human rights and for these defectors, but another part of it is it's to further their political aims, to kind of use these narratives and these stories and to kind of further the criticism of the North. But the left is equally the left has kind of consistently ignored these groups and tried not to engage with them, has not supported a lot of funding or assistance traditionally compared to the right. And again, this goes with why would they do that? They would do that because they don't want to be seen as encouraging defector. They don't want to be seen as encouraging defection, and they don't want to be seen as supporting or giving support to North Korean defectors who might turn around and criticize the North Korean government. So but in the consequence of that is that the left kind of turns a blind eye to the very humanitarian, economic, social, cultural needs of North Korean defectors living in South Korea.
Yeah, and I also wonder where South Korean human rights fit into this discussion, because during the military dictatorships, it was the student demonstrators and the labor movements and those on the progressive side of South Korean politics who were fighting for human rights in South Korea. And I'm talking about precisely those civil and political rights, right? The right to organize, the right to have freedom of expression, the right to have a different political view, the right not to be put in a prison camp for your political beliefs. What's happened there?
Yeah, I mean, this is the paradox at the key of my paper, and just kind of at the key of my experience with North Korean human rights, because when I first went to South Korea, not when I first went to South Korea, when I first started when I went to when I went to South Korea in 2012 to study on a Fulbright to meet North Koreans defectors, and I wasn't specifically interested in North Korean human rights at the time, but I was very surprised to find again, this is 2012. This is kind of near the peak of interest in human rights in South Korea. I was very surprised to find that the organizations who were supporting and promoting North Korean defectors in the South were conservatives and not liberals. And and I thought, well, historically we have thought, as you said, that it has been liberals who were kind of pushing for humanitarian rights and kind of criticizing like repressive regimes and whatnot. So why on the issue of North Korean human rights is it flip-flopped? Why is it that for Korean during the democratization period, the liberals were pressing for civic and political rights. They were criticizing the South Korean regime, right? And it was the conservatives who were downplaying human rights abuses by the South Korean government. Now, fast forward 30 years on the issue of North Korean human rights. Now it's the opposite, right? Now it's the right who's criticizing civic and political, the absence of civic and political rights in North Korea, and it's liberals who are downplaying these rights violations by the North Korean government, right, and who are kind of ignoring South Korean or North Korean defectors in the South. So this is why I think what is consistent from the 80s to from the fight against dictatorship in the South to North Korean human rights today, what is consistent in these groups? Their attitude towards towards human rights in general has not been consistent, right? As we said, it's flip-flopped. So the question is, what is consistent? What is consistent?
Here it comes. It's attitudes towards U.S. hegemony, isn't it? So if you were against U.S. hegemony and U.S. interference in South Korean politics in the 1980s, then you were in favor of civic and political rights. And if you're still against that now, then you're in favor of economic, social, and cultural rights in North Korea.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's really the determining factor here in both of those cases comes back to U.S. involvement.
That's right. Yeah, and your stance, your core identity as a liberal or as a conservative in South Korea, your core partisan identity. That's the thing that is consistent, and it just happens to, depending on which side of which regime you're looking at or whose rights you're looking at. Yeah, it can flip flop. Yeah.
Right. So there are a very, very small number of examples of political activists in South Korea who have remained consistent over the years. So who, for example, fought for civic and political rights in South Korea during the military dictatorship and who now agitate for the same civic and political rights in North Korea. But by remaining a consistency on which rights they're agitating for, presumably they've made a change on how they view U.S. hegemony, and that they weren't okay with in the beginning, but now they're okay with it.
Yeah, I think when I first encountered these legislators, and we're talking about, maybe you can rattle off a few of the names.
Yeah, Ha Tae-kyung is one of the legislators in the People's Power Party, and not a lawmaker, but an activist, Kim Yong-hwan,
right,
who was a student underground activist who met Kim Il-sung back in the 1980s when he was a true believer, and now he's very much not, and he agitates for helping North Koreans with civic and political rights. So there's just two off the top of my head.
Yeah. I think when I was kind of immersed in South Korean politics, at the nexus of South Korean politics and human rights, back in 2012, 2013, 2014, these people seemed kind of strange. They seem kind of strange. Like from the perspective of South Korean partisan politics, they just seem like they're totally flip-flopping. They have no kind of underlying allegiance to their party or faction or whatever. But I think as I've done this paper, I feel like these people have been vindicated in the sense that they remain true. What motivated them from the very beginning until now was not their partisan leaning, left or right. It was their particular stance on North Korea. They are the minority of legislators and political activists whose primary identity was on their stance over human rights, not on their partisan identity. Right? And so I think from that perspective, this paper kind of vindicates their, or at least we can understand like what was their logic. They felt like they had chosen a particular stance on human rights, and the party had abandoned them. They felt like they were pushing civic and political rights all along, and then at some point the left stopped doing that when it came to North Korea, because the U.S. was pushing on the other side, and they didn't want to be aligned with that, and they didn't want to be aligned with the, kind of a negative stance towards the North Korean government and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think I have a lot more empathy or appreciation for their kind of political journey this last
Jacob, can you think of
generation,
any
decade.
organizations who push for all human rights, regardless of whether they're CPR or ESCR, in the North Korean situation?
Yeah, in the North Korean, I think that the clearest example that I've seen has been the British government. The British government puts out an annual report of the state of human rights in North Korea, and they don't hold any punches. They are very critical of the North Korean government's human rights record, but at the same time, they are engaging with North Korean government. They have an embassy, a North Korean embassy in London, and they support United Nations efforts for food distribution and medical aid and all those things. So I think that's one of the examples. I don't think there's not an organization that I guess maybe in South Korea and the US there might be some smaller organizations which are less involved in partisan politics. Like I think we talked about in the past, we talked about maybe Good Friends. I don't know how active they are today, but
Right. I can't seem to find them online. If there is anyone listening who's either from Good Friends or familiar with Good Friends, do please put them in touch with me because I'd love to have somebody on the show. Jacob, moving on to our last couple of questions here. In your conclusion, you write that, quote, Danielle Chubb and Andrew Yo have formulated the most pragmatic prescription for promoting North Korean human rights. Try a little bit of everything. Specifically, they argue in favor of three approaches: the top-down legal and institutional approach, the bottom-up approach of subversive tactics, and humanitarian engagement focusing on social and economic rights, end quote. What do you think? Do you agree with their approach?
I think they're right in theory. But but again, if the core issue here is not, again, the whole point of the paper is the core issue over the division is not people's stance on North Korean human rights or North Korean human rights strategies, right? Strategies for achieving that. The core issue is partisan politics, right? So I don't think that these two groups sitting down, the left and the right sitting down and negotiating a common strategy for North Korean human rights is really possible, right? I think we have to address the underlying division, which is, what should our attitude be towards North Korea, right? Can we trust North Korea? Do we engage with North Korea, right? How much we have to address these kind of underlying divisions in our view of, what should our orientation be to the North Korean government, and what should the role of the United States be in that? What should the role of the United States be on the Korean Peninsula? Those things I think have to be included in the conversation about North Korean human rights, because at the end of the day, that's what has driven people's stances on the issue. So,
right. So actually, you're suggesting make U.S. hegemony and U.S. influence part of the discussion on approaches to North Korean human rights.
If you're going to try to get the left and right together to talk about it, you have to talk about the politics first.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's certainly an interesting approach. Let's see if it gains traction. I wish you all the best with that, Jacob. Thank you for coming on the NK News podcast today. Listeners can look out for your paper titled Decamping the Partisans, U.S. Hegemony and South Korea's Divisive Discourse on North Korean Human Rights. They can find it in Korean Studies online or offline. I will put a link in the show notes. And they can find more of your work and interests at souljake.com. Thanks very much, Jacob.
Thanks, Jocko. It's been a pleasure.
Attention, North Korea portfolio professionals. Are you in need of more than just sloppy and spotty South Korean news coverage on the DPRK? If so, I present to you NK Pro. Born from the established news-gathering reputation of NK News, NK Pro leverages staff experience and top-notch technology to provide subscribers with superior knowledge and tools to achieve their goals. Expect daily analysis, exclusive tools, and a suite of research tools that cover everything from North Korean state media to the whereabouts of DPRK vessels and aircraft. How cool is that? In a world where the landscape of North Korea seems unknowable to many, NK Pro cuts through the noise and provides you with the quality, reliability, and timeliness you need. Stay ahead, stay informed, and master the landscape with NK Pro. Trust me, it's a game changer. Interested? Visit nknews.org/professionals to claim your free 30-day trial of NK Pro. Once again, that's nknews.org/professionals. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alana Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.